At 4:30 a.m., somewhere along a 1,200-kilometer front stretching across eastern Ukraine, the battlefield changed quietly but decisively. No massive tank columns, no thunder of artillery barrages. Instead, over 11,000 unmanned systems surged into action in a single day. Small, mid-range, and long-range drones, some costing just a few $1,000s, began dismantling billion-dollar military infrastructure deep behind Russian lines. Within weeks, the numbers became impossible to ignore. Over 150,000 verified targets hit in March alone, 143 logistics hubs shattered, 52 command centers neutralized, 20 key oil and energy facilities disrupted. Entire supply chains collapsed not at the front, but miles behind it. Russian forces, once relying on depth and reserves, suddenly found themselves blind, disconnected, and exposed. Communications failed, reinforcements stalled, offensive momentum vanished. Meanwhile, Ukrainian interceptor drones were rewriting the rules of defense. In just 3 months, they intercepted nearly 14,000 incoming aerial threats, including waves of long-range attack drones designed to cripple infrastructure. The sky itself was no longer contested, it was controlled. Inside, the Kremlin warnings began to surface. Senior officials, military analysts, and even loyal insiders started signaling something unthinkable. The balance of power had shifted. But one man refused to see it. As reports piled up and losses mounted, Russia's leadership continued to project confidence, launching offensives that stalled almost immediately, feeding troops into a battlefield increasingly dominated by machines. And then the unthinkable happened. What is unfolding in Ukraine is not just another phase of a prolonged conflict, it is a transformation of modern warfare itself. On one side stands Vladimir Putin's military machine, built on mass mobilization, heavy artillery, and traditional doctrines rooted in Soviet-era strategy. On the other stands Volodymyr Zelensky's rapidly evolving force, increasingly defined not by numbers, but by technology adaptability and precision. The battlefield stretches across regions like Donetsk and Luhansk, where Russia has spent years trying to grind forward through sheer weight of manpower and firepower. But geography is no longer the decisive factor. Instead, the war has shifted into layers, frontline trenches, rear logistics hubs, and deep strategic infrastructure, all now within reach of Ukraine's expanding drone network. Historically, Russia relied on depth as its greatest advantage. The idea was simple: even if frontline units suffered setbacks, reserves and supply lines behind them would sustain momentum. That doctrine worked in previous conflicts. It does not work here, because now those rear areas are no longer safe. Ukraine's mid-range drones, bridging the gap between short-range FPV systems and long-range strike platforms, have become the centerpiece of this transformation. They operate in the critical zone between 20 and 300 kilometers, an area once considered relatively secure. Now it is a kill zone. The contrast could not be sharper. Russian forces deploy expensive air defense systems worth tens of millions of dollars, yet struggle to intercept swarms of low-cost drones. Ukraine, by comparison, leverages scalable, rapidly produced systems that can be replaced faster than they can be destroyed. Cheap versus expensive, agile versus rigid, innovative versus outdated. Even more striking is the tempo. In January, Ukraine launched just over 40 mid-range drone strikes. By March, that number had surged to over 100, nearly tripling in less than 90 days. At the same time, daily drone operations reached industrial levels, tens of thousands of missions shaping the battlefield in real time. According to multiple battlefield assessments, including Western intelligence insights referenced by Kiev, this is the most favorable position Ukraine has held in nearly a year. But this is not just about drones. It is about a systemic shift where information speed and precision are replacing mass and attrition. Russia's command structure, often slow and centralized, struggles to respond to threats that appear and disappear within minutes. Ukrainian forces, by contrast, operate in decentralized networks, allowing rapid adaptation and continuous pressure. And yet, despite mounting evidence, the Kremlin's official narrative remains unchanged. Public messaging continues to emphasize strength, progress, and inevitable victory. The question is no longer whether the battlefield has changed. The question is whether Russia can adapt before that change becomes irreversible. By early March, the shift was no longer theoretical, it was visible, measurable, and accelerating. Ukrainian forces began executing a layered campaign that struck Russia not just at the front, but across its entire operational depth. First came the disruption. Mid-range drones slipped through weakened air defenses and targeted logistics hubs, fuel depots, ammunition warehouses, and transport nodes that kept Russian units supplied. Within days, supply routes that had functioned for months began to collapse. Trucks stalled. Rail movements slowed. Entire sectors reported shortages of artillery shells and fuel. Then came the second wave command paralysis. Ukrainian strikes systematically hit more than 50 Russian command posts, severing coordination between frontline units and higher command. Orders were delayed, miscommunicated, or never delivered at all. In a war where timing is everything, even a few minutes of disruption created chaos. Units advanced without support. Others held positions long after they should have withdrawn. And then the third layer, energy and infrastructure. Drone strikes reached deep into Russia's operational rear, hitting over 20 oil, gas, and energy facilities. These were not symbolic targets, they were critical nodes sustaining military operations. Fires broke out, production halted, repairs took days, sometimes weeks. The cost was not just financial, it was strategic. At the same time, Ukraine intensified its defensive transformation. Russian forces launched wave after wave of long-range drones, hoping to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses and cripple infrastructure. But something unexpected happened. Ukraine's interceptor drones, cheap, fast, and highly effective, began neutralizing these attacks at scale. In January, nearly 3,000 incoming drones were intercepted. By March, that number had surged to over 7,600. This was not just improvement, it was exponential growth. The result, Russia's strategy of exhausting Ukraine through sustained aerial pressure began to fail. Power grids held, military installations remained operational, civilian disruption, while still present, no longer translated into battlefield advantage. And then came the first major twist. As Ukrainian drone dominance expanded, Russian air defense systems, already stretched thin, became primary targets. Once those defenses were degraded, entire aerial corridors opened up. Ukrainian drones could now operate with reduced risk, increasing both the frequency and accuracy of strikes. The second twist followed quickly. Inside Russia itself, far from the front lines, key Baltic ports began to shut down under repeated drone pressure. These ports were essential for oil exports, one of Russia's main economic lifelines. Each disruption sent shockwaves through global markets and cut directly into Moscow's revenue streams. And then the third twist, perhaps the most dangerous of all. Criticism began to surface from within. Military bloggers, defense insiders, and even figures tied to Russia's defense industry started questioning the effectiveness of current tactics. Some warned that mobilization would not solve the problem. Others pointed directly at systemic failures, outdated doctrines, slow adaptation, and a lack of technological innovation. Even senior officials reportedly raised alarms about Ukraine's growing technological and numerical superiority in drone warfare. But on the battlefield, none of that slowed the pace. Russian forces continued launching offensives, often with minimal gains and heavy losses. In one 24-hour period alone, over 1,400 personnel were reported lost in stalled assaults. What emerged was a pattern: advances measured in meters, setbacks measured in systems destroyed, and a growing imbalance between effort and outcome. Ukraine, meanwhile, continued pressing its advantage, coordinating strikes, exploiting gaps, and turning technology into momentum. This was no longer a static war of attrition. It had become a dynamic system, one side adapting faster than the other, one side learning in real time, while the other repeated the same playbook. And with every passing day, that gap widened. What began as a tactical shift is now triggering a cascade of strategic consequences, economic, military, and societal, that extend far beyond the battlefield. At the military level, the numbers alone tell a devastating story. By March 2026, Russia's monthly casualty rate surged to over 35,000, a 29% increase compared to previous months. Even more striking, up to 96% of these losses were linked to drone-related operations, either direct strikes or indirect effects, such as disrupted logistics and failed coordination. This is not just attrition, it is systemic degradation. Traditional Russian tactics, mass infantry assaults supported by artillery, are being neutralized by precision strikes that cost a fraction of the price. A single advanced tank can cost millions of dollars. A drone capable of disabling it may cost less than a family car. The economic imbalance is staggering. According to assessments frequently cited by outlets such as Reuters and Defense News, modern warfare is increasingly defined by cost-efficiency ratios. Ukraine's approach, high volume, low cost, high impact, has effectively inverted the economics of war. And the financial consequences are beginning to surface. Russia's energy sector, one of its primary revenue sources, is under growing pressure. Drone strikes on oil infrastructure and Baltic export terminals have disrupted operations, delaying shipments and cutting into profits. In one instance, an anticipated windfall of nearly $1 billion linked to global oil price fluctuations was reportedly erased due to repeated strikes on key ports. This is where the battlefield meets the balance sheet. Energy exports fund military operations. Disrupt those exports, and the entire war effort feels the strain. Insurance costs rise. Shipping routes become riskier. Investors hesitate. The ripple effects spread through global markets, affecting not just Russia, but energy-dependent economies worldwide. At the same time, internal pressure within Russia is intensifying. Prominent voices within the defense ecosystem have begun openly criticizing the country's strategic direction. Figures associated with drone development and military analysis are pointing to a deeper issue, not just tactical mistakes, but structural stagnation, a lack of innovation, a rigid command hierarchy, a system slow to adapt to technological disruption. Even within official circles, warnings have reportedly been issued. Senior defense leadership has acknowledged that Ukraine has achieved both technological and numerical superiority in key areas of drone warfare. And yet the response remains limited. No major doctrinal overhaul, no rapid restructuring. Instead, continued reliance on existing strategies that are producing diminishing returns. Societally, the impact is equally profound. As losses mount and economic pressure increases, public sentiment begins to shift. While official narratives emphasize resilience and strength, alternative voices, military bloggers, analysts, and independent commentators are painting a more complex picture. One of stagnation, of missed opportunities, of a war that is becoming increasingly difficult to justify in terms of cost versus outcome. Internationally, the perception is also changing. Statements from European officials, including figures like Jean-Noel Barrot, have framed the conflict as a strategic, political, and economic setback for Russia. Broader analyses from outlets such as BBC and DW highlight the erosion of Russia's influence not just in Ukraine, but across multiple regions. From Africa to the Middle East, competing powers are expanding their presence, often outpacing Moscow in investment and diplomatic engagement. The war is no longer contained within Ukraine's borders. It is reshaping alliances, redefining military doctrine, and exposing the vulnerabilities of systems once considered robust. And at the center of it all lies a simple but unsettling reality. A conflict that was expected to be resolved in days has evolved into a prolonged struggle, one where technology, not territory, is becoming the decisive factor. What is happening in Ukraine is no longer just a regional conflict, it is a live demonstration of how global warfare is being rewritten in real time. Every major power is watching, calculating, and quietly adjusting its own military doctrine. For NATO, the implications are immediate. The alliance has long invested in advanced platforms, stealth aircraft missile defense systems, and heavy armored units. But Ukraine's battlefield is proving something different. Dominance does not always come from the most expensive systems, but from the most adaptable ones. Swarms of low-cost drones are now achieving what billion-dollar programs once promised: persistent surveillance, rapid strike capability, and operational disruption at scale. For the United States under President Donald Trump, the lesson is both strategic and industrial. The Pentagon is increasingly focused on scaling production of unmanned systems, recognizing that future conflicts, whether in Eastern Europe or the Indo-Pacific, will require not just technological superiority, but manufacturing depth. The ability to produce thousands of drones per month may prove more decisive than a handful of advanced jets. China, meanwhile, is studying this conflict with particular intensity. Beijing has already invested heavily in drone technology and autonomous systems. Ukraine's success reinforces a key principle of Chinese military thinking: asymmetric advantage. The idea that cheaper mass-produced systems can neutralize more expensive adversaries aligns closely with China's approach to potential conflicts in the South China Sea and beyond. In the Middle East, the ripple effects are equally significant. Countries like Iran have long relied on drone warfare as a central component of their strategy, but what Ukraine is demonstrating is a far more integrated model where drones are not just tools of disruption, but the backbone of an entire operational framework. This raises concerns across the region, particularly in strategic choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, where even limited drone activity could have outsized global consequences. The economic dimension cannot be ignored either. Global energy markets are already sensitive to disruptions. As drone strikes hit infrastructure and ports, even small interruptions can send prices fluctuating. Analysts from outlets like Reuters and Bloomberg have repeatedly pointed out that modern conflicts now carry immediate financial consequences measured not just in damage but in market reactions. And then there is the question of doctrine. For decades, military strategy has been built around the concept of overwhelming force air superiority, armored breakthroughs, and sustained artillery barrages. But Ukraine is challenging that model. Instead of overwhelming force, it is applying persistent pressure. Instead of large-scale offensives, it is executing continuous microstrikes that cumulatively degrade the enemy. This is a different kind of war, one where time, data, and adaptability matter more than sheer volume. Looking ahead, the next 3 to 6 months could prove normative. If Ukraine maintains its current technological edge, it could continue to erode Russia's operational capacity, targeting logistics infrastructure and command systems until large-scale offensives become unsustainable. This would not necessarily produce a sudden breakthrough, but rather a gradual collapse of effectiveness. On the other hand, if Russia manages to adapt by improving its own drone capabilities, restructuring its command systems, or finding ways to counter Ukraine's aerial advantage, the balance could shift again. There are already signs of potential responses: increased investment in electronic warfare, efforts to harden infrastructure, attempts to decentralize command structures. But whether these measures can keep pace with Ukraine's rapid innovation remains uncertain. What is clear is this: the war in Ukraine is no longer just about territory or politics. It is about the future of warfare itself. And every nation with a stake in global security is taking notes. What began as a conventional invasion has transformed into something far more disruptive, a technological turning point that is reshaping not only this war, but the future of conflict itself. Ukraine's rise in drone dominance has exposed a fundamental vulnerability in traditional military power. Massive armies, heavy armor, and centralized command structures once seen as pillars of strength are now being challenged by speed, precision, and adaptability. The numbers tell a clear story: thousands of targets neutralized, supply lines fractured, and entire operational zones destabilized without the need for large-scale offensives. At the same time, Russia's response reveals an equally important reality. Despite mounting pressure from battlefield losses to economic strain and internal criticism, the strategic direction remains largely unchanged. The gap between perception and reality continues to widen, and that gap may be the most dangerous factor of all. Because wars are not only lost on the battlefield, they are lost when adaptation fails, when warnings are ignored, when systems designed for one kind of conflict are applied to another. Right now, Ukraine is operating inside the future of warfare network, decentralized and driven by technology. Russia, in many ways, is still fighting in the past. But history has shown that conflicts can shift quickly, so the key questions now are unavoidable. Will Russia successfully adapt to this new form of warfare before its operational capacity erodes beyond recovery? Will Ukraine sustain its technological edge long enough to turn tactical success into strategic breakthrough? And perhaps most critically, how will other global powers respond as they absorb the lessons of this conflict and prepare for the wars of tomorrow? Because what is happening here will not stay here. It will influence military planning in Washington, Beijing, Brussels, and beyond. It will shape defense budgets, industrial strategies, and geopolitical alignments for years to come. For now, the battlefield continues to evolve quietly, relentlessly, and at a pace that few predicted. If this analysis helped break down what's really happening behind the headlines, consider subscribing for more deep dive coverage on global conflicts, military strategy, and the technologies redefining modern war. Because the next shift may already be underway.